Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you all to the last session of the day. So we hope that you found the sessions engaging and informative, the presentations which were done by in the research sessions that we had just before the session. So now we have Professor Ramanathan Subramaniam, Editor-in-Chief, and Ms. Diana Joseph, Managing Editor, who will speak a few words on Vikalpa, the journal of IIM Ahmedabad.
Good afternoon. I'm Ramanathan and that's Diana. I won't take much time. We represent Vikalpa, the journal for decision makers. Thank you. I just wanted to introduce the journal to you, and please do consider it as an outlet for your research. I do see some who have already published with us. It is an open access journal, probably the oldest management journal in India. And as the name suggests, we look for the bulk of the researches has a significant managerial implication and for decision makers, which also I saw in some of the sessions. So this looks like good material that you may want to send to Vikalpa. And we do encourage interdisciplinary work also, which again, I saw in some of the presentations here.
Yes, just that we've published a special issue once before on insolvency and bankruptcy, and yes, we look forward to interacting with you all once the sessions are done, and look forward to contributions from all of you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank
you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am. May I request the members for the next session, Mr. Prashant Das, Associate Professor of Real Estate Finance at IIM Ahmedabad, Ms. Rebecca Perry, Professor at Nottingham Law School, UK, Mr. Mahesh Vyas, MD and CEO, Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, and Ms. Kokila Jayaram, Deputy General Manager, IBBI, to kindly join us on the dais. The IBBI launched its first research initiative in 2019 with an aim to promote research and discourse in areas relevant for insolvency and bankruptcy regime in general, and that in India. So this session is an initiative under the research initiative of the IBBI. With this, may I now introduce a noted scholar and professor, Mr. Prashant Das, who is an associate professor of real estate finance at IIM Ahmedabad, and he has also served as an associate professor of real estate finance and acting director of real estate finance and economics institute at EHL Lausanne, Switzerland. Sir has also been a visiting faculty at various universities across the globe and has also been serving on the editorial boards of various journals. Sir, may I please request to kindly address the audience.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It usually takes me 3 to 4 weeks to prepare a talk like this in front of such an august audience. And in full disclosure, I'll be very honest, this talk didn't give me much time. And I had to prepare a few things to speak about. Thanks to my colleague, Professor Ram Mohan. I did what any millennial would do, Google. I followed what my MBA students would do. And the motivation to go to Google was not as frivolous as it sounds. Back in 2009, when I was a PhD student in Atlanta, Google started publishing its trends data. It started publishing trends data retrospectively. Google Trends data is one of the most powerful public sources of data that we as economists have access to. What they do is track searches, significant searches with critical mass of people in a time series trend. So I went ahead, and the first idea that came to my mind was to see if we could predict insolvencies and bankruptcies using Google Trends. When I went with that idea to my advisor, he looked at me with a very frowning face, as was very usual of him. And I had an econometric setup ready. I had a methodology, I had my literature survey, and I also was lucky enough to get data on the history of bankruptcies in California. But my professor wouldn't like the idea, not at all. So I wrote to Dr. Hal Varian, the famous microeconomist. At that time, he used to be the chief economist of Google. And I told him that, look, my advisor is not buying the idea that Google could be a useful data for research. And he sends me a bunch of papers that at that time were rather fledgling. I mean, no one knew about those papers, and some of those researchers were also not very well known. The idea was that we could use Google Trends as an important economic indicator for research. Fast forward 2-3 years, some of those papers became seminal papers. Da, Engelberg, and Gao have published 2 papers in Journal of Finance using Google Trends. And thankfully, my own paper got published in a good real estate journal afterwards. Well, long story short, the point that I'm making here is that I'm going to show you some slides which on the face value may appear tacky and cheesy to you, but I assure you that Google Trends data has been accepted as a legitimate proxy for macroeconomic trends. And the question is, why do people like me, why do at that time a young researcher had to lean on Google Trends data? Because good quality of data was not available. You know, PhD students are thirsty for data. And if you don't have data, you have to find means to get access to the data. And that was the solution. So when you look at Google Trends data, you are essentially looking at demand for information. So I'm going to show you demand for information about SARFAESI and IBC in India. I guess SARFAESI was introduced somewhere in 2002. Google Trends only starts in 2004. You see, the trends on SARFAESI has been quite stable, plateaued, but at a decent level. In other words, people have been curious and eager to learn about SARFAESI. But then you see something else comes up in 2016. And this hall is the best, is full of the right people to guess why 2016 October is important. That's when IBC was introduced. And suddenly the interest in IBC has spiked up. What this graph tells you is not what people are searching about. If we believe in the papers published in top economics and finance journals and many other social sciences areas, what you're looking at is common public's curiosity and eagerness to learn about. I guess this one is the IBBI. Then the next question is, what are people more interested in, IBBI or IBC? And if you look at this graph here, it's very clear, with due respect to all the IBBI dignitaries that we have in the room, people are more interested in the code itself than IBBI. In other words, it's not the institution building that has gotten people excited, it's the new series of phenomena that IBC has triggered in the country. So some of us may still not buy the idea that Google Trends that we see here are actual fundamental economic information. What if some people are just Googling it because they have nothing else to do, right? A lot of millennials, they're spending their time on internet and they're just Googling it because they see it in news. Many a times, the demand for information is triggered by the supply of information. And we must admire IBBI for its phenomenal PR that they have done, that the awareness about IBC in India is pretty good. So you might argue that people are searching for IBC or IBBI simply because there is a lot of news about it. Now look at this graph. You see that after 2016, the curiosity about both IBC and IBBI peaked, it plateaued, and then it fell down. And then let's go back to the previous slide again. We see that that is not the case with the overall curiosity about IBC and IBBI. That simply means that the quality of curiosity the quality of the nature of demand for information about IBC and IBBI is more serious than what you could make of it simply by looking at Google Trends. So that is the demand side. What about the supply side? In economics, there is a demand side of the equation, there is supply side. Okay, we know that there is a lot of demand about information, about knowledge, about insights related to insolvency and bankruptcy. And by the way, all the trends that I have shown you are related to searches done within the Indian territory. This is Google Ngram. Ngram simply captures how often, in percent terms, a particular word has been used in books published all over the world. And Google indexes around nearly 1 million books of the world. So all important books have been indexed by Google Books. And if you see, bankruptcy is nothing new. The interest in bankruptcy was as strong in 1800s as it is today in relative terms. And then when you look at the recent decades here, since 2000, since the onset of the 21st century, you see that the supply of insights and knowledge about bankruptcy has drastically fallen. Does it mean that people are not studying bankruptcy enough? Does it mean that there is not enough research going on about bankruptcies? Not really, because this morning I collected some information on how much research is being produced in India related to insolvency and bankruptcy. And you will be surprised to see that the quantum of research produced by Indian researchers in 2021 related to insolvency and bankruptcy is almost as good as what was produced in a whole decade that preceded the 21st century. There is tremendous amount of interest among researchers about creating new insights about insolvency and bankruptcy. But we have a problem. The problem is when you start browsing through a lot of this research, a lot of it is opinion-based pieces. A lot of it is not using inferential statistics. And a lot of it is something that an economist or a finance researcher would look at with some degree of suspicion, because there is an issue of external validity, as we call it in academies. So what we need here is good quality data. And as you are all aware that as academics, we are greedy for data. We smell it, and like honeybees, we swarm if there is one source of data available. IMF has, in 2019, come up with a paper that categorically promotes the availability of insolvency and bankruptcy related data. And this is an NBER paper, I guess this is 2001. And being a student of real estate, my interest from IBC or insolvency or bankruptcy related work lies in the discount, the valuation discount that insolvent assets are attributed to. And if you see here, and it has also been reiterated in some of the earlier sessions that we have had, that one of the biggest problems with insolvency and the resolution process is the uncertainty in the valuation. So when a company goes bust, or when an when a borrower has defaulted, yes, there will be a price discovery process, but that price discovery process perhaps happens in an inefficient and an oligopolic market, where we do not have a benchmark to say whether the price at which the asset traded after bankruptcy was the right price. So that has already been pointed out as one of the biggest problems related to insolvency and bankruptcy related research. At the same time, when you look at countries like the US, this is a paper from 1999, published in Journal of Financial Economics. They had access to the data where they were able to pinpoint specific categories of assets, and studies like this allowed them to come up with an estimate of the discount given the nature of the insolvency in their country. And this is where we would like to be. So with full admiration to what IBBI has done and what IBC has been doing in this country, this is time that we had the right amount of data so that we could not only replicate what the West is doing, but perhaps do an even better job. And for God's sake, we are a 1.4 billion population country, and the amount of bankruptcies that we are going to see is perhaps, going to be good enough. For researcher, it's not a bad news. And hence, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you to this session where IBBI is just going to reveal some good news. So this session brings you good news that there will be data available. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for your presentation on this unique and interesting research initiative. Ladies and gentlemen, may I now introduce another learned speaker, Ms. Rebecca Perry, who is a professor at Nottingham Law School, UK. She has authored a thesis on avoidable transactions in insolvency law, and her main research interests lie in the areas of insolvency law, in particular international and comparative insolvency law, with a focus on UK, USA, EU, India, and China. Ma'am, may I please request you to kindly address the audience?
Thank you, and I'm very grateful for having the opportunity to speak today about this project on insolvencies and digital economies. Now, it's an example of a sector-specific approach to insolvencies, and you might wonder why this, when you've had papers already on financial institutions, and then there might be other sectors that demand a sector-specific focus. But what I'll do in this paper is to outline why a focus on digital economies is likely to be important in coming years, given the importance of digital economies in modern society. So to give you an overview of what I'll be looking at in the paper, briefly I will highlight why digital economies are important, and including for India. I will highlight some of the challenges of digital economies, and in particular looking at what problems there will be in the event of an insolvency in this sector. So I'll look at the risks arising from insolvencies and how they can be handled. So looking first of all at the digital economy in India, it obviously is very important, and statistics back this up. So in a study including McKinsey in 2015, it was thought that the IT sector in India could be worth $300 to $350 billion. And the IT industry contributes significantly to the Indian economy, around 8% in 2017 to 2018. And of course, COVID-19 accelerated a lot of dependence on digital economies. It enabled us to work from home in a way that we would only previously have done in the office. Cloud computing, for example, can enable you to have the same desktop at home as you have in the office. And of course, we are familiar with how technologies can facilitate collaborations, planning of projects, rapid accessibility of services, and so many other aspects. I've given this paper a couple of times to Indian audiences, and this is the first time when I've actually been in the country. The rest of the time I've just been stood in my house communicating via Teams or Zoom or some other. And so ways of working have really changed, and it may be that laws need to change in response to that. As an example of India's strength in IT, of course, there is outsourcing, and India being among the top 5 destinations for London tech companies. Part of the reason for that is that comparatively, India has got a good legal framework to support these contracts that other countries don't necessarily have. And I've already gone through some of the benefits. Easy accessibility, so consumers will use technology all the time, paying bills online, contracts that are signed electronically are much more hygienic than pen and paper in the COVID age. And it enables greater social inclusion through digital ID cards, where India's got a world-leading example, generates employment, and lots of other benefits. The potential of digital economies has been noticed, I think, by virtually every country, so that there will be digital economy strategies in many countries, so not just India, but also China, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal as a program as well. So it's an area that is attracting attention, but what doesn't tend to be attention grabbing is what would happen in the event of an insolvency. Briefly, the challenges of digital economies, as we know, these are global businesses, and it can be difficult for any one country to regulate these businesses as a result. I use the term supranational for that reason. They're not just international, but potentially they are beyond the reach of regulators, simply because if a regulator gets tough, then the business can easily relocate to another jurisdiction. Other challenges are that existing concepts that we know, such as property, can present difficult questions because of the nature of assets and rapidly evolving categories of intangible assets that we have to think about the legal implications of. Also, there can be a potential lack of understanding of the technologies that we use. In the same way that the banks got into difficulties because nobody really understood the complexities that were presenting risks, we have the same issue with digital services, arguably, because of the technical nature of those businesses. And you've got a mismatch where there will be people who will know the technical side, but not the insolvency side. For example, the risk of insolvency is mentioned in computing science literature, but only to the extent of, oh, that would be really bad. And the details haven't been worked out. One of the issues is too big to fail potential, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So multinational nature, I've already covered this, but there are problems for regulatory potential and also conflict of laws issues, because, for example, in cloud computing, your data might be in another country because that's the most cost-effective way to organize it. And there will be case law that will come up in that context. So the challenges to existing concepts, as I've said, issues of property, also issues of liability. If you have something like blockchain, an unpermissioned blockchain where anybody can edit the code, what happens if something goes wrong? Who is going to be liable? Well, the answer may well be that in that environment, if you get involved, you're taking a risk and you have to suffer the consequences, because in unpermissioned blockchain, for example, you don't have necessarily the same approach to law that you would have in commercial context that we're used to dealing with. Going back to the point about potential lack of understanding, for example, we'll use cloud computing as an example. Lots of people use cloud computing every day without even realizing that they're doing it, because we use it to store data, we use it to access services, and lots of other things. But we don't really know what that means. Most people would tend to think of something like this weather map symbol as representing the cloud, and it hovers above us somehow, and our data ends up in the sky. But all it means is that data is stored off-site. It's not on your computer, it's in a data center somewhere. And that presents difficulties potentially if that data center gets into difficulties, because how do you get your data back? I'll come back to cloud computing in a second, but the focus obviously is on failure prevention. We don't want failures to happen needlessly, and there are approaches to good corporate governance and good data management standards that can be adopted. Cybersecurity can also be important. Having robust systems for that can help to mitigate possible risks of insolvencies. So partly it's about having an environment that encourages the sustainability of digital services. And certainly this is the focus in the UK and the EU. So rather than looking at what happens if something fails, there are robust systems in place to protect essential digital services. And alongside that, you've got self-regulation by, for example, cloud service providers and by international standards. So in the UK, this was, while the UK was still a member of the EU, the Network and Information Systems regulations were adopted. And this is a law which protects the national infrastructure. And it includes lots of different things, but it includes digital services because of how important digital services are in day-to-day life. So in the 2018 regulations, digital services are included among sectors which need a high common level of security and which are subject to risk management and reporting requirements. So there's a big emphasis on spotting trouble and making sure that nothing develops into a real risk of real risk to businesses. Included in digital services are lots of things that we will use every day but aren't familiar with. So things like top-level domain name registries, domain name services, and internet exchange points are really important, but most of us don't know what they are. So when we go on the internet, it's easy because all we have to do is remember the name or go into Google or whatever, and the top name domain name registry will tell the computer who that is in terms of a string of code. So you don't have to remember the string of code. All you have to remember is the name, google.com or whatever, and the top name level domain name registry will identify that. The domain name service is like a telephone directory, so again that's important for internet traffic. And internet exchange points speed up the pace of internet traffic. If you send an email, it will ping from one point to another, and the more points you have, the quicker it will be. So if you have a low number of internet exchange points, because some have failed, then internet traffic will slow down. If the domain name registry or the domain name service falls by the wayside, then internet commerce instantly becomes much more difficult and in many ways impracticable. Of a lesser importance, but still included in those regulations, are cloud computing, which I'll come back to because I think that's one where there are real risks. Also online marketplaces and search engines, which I don't think present such real risks because of the availability of competitors. You can just switch to a different service, which you can't do so easily with cloud computing. Going back to a point I made earlier, at its worst, the digital services sector presents too big to fail potential in a similar way to the banks. Because what you've got is a concentration of business around a small number of market players. And the way that the sector goes tends to be that it becomes more and more concentrated. So unless regulators step in, it's you're going to have, or you do have, huge global businesses. And it's a risk that's been noted by Lloyd's of London in the cloud computing sector, saying that as more companies rely on the cloud to operate. A select few providers have come to dominate the market. This reliance on a small number of companies creates the potential for systemic risk for service users. So if the cloud computing company fails, then the risks that presented by that are huge, and large possibility of economic loss. Tech providers can and do fail, and these are a couple of examples that in a paper that I did with Niti Shekhar, we found in India. So there have been examples of failure in India, and then in other systems. This is a UK example. So this was a data center operator. So one of these places, that's what they look like, where you've got lots of different machines where data is stored. This data center failed. And rather than shutting down, which would have caused the loss of the data, it requested funding from customers for £1 million. So if you add 2 zeros, that's the amount in rupees, to enable the business to continue operating and for customer data to be safeguarded and securely extracted. And it was said that needed 16 weeks. Why does it need that long? The process of data extraction in high volume is a slow process. It's not like we're used to in the movies, where somebody copies a whole hard drive onto a data stick in 10 seconds while the bad guys come in. It's much more difficult than that, and we can be dealing with terabytes of data, and it's telling that if Google or if Amazon want your business, they will send a truck to collect the data. That's the volume of data that we're dealing with. It's not something that fits onto a little data stick. It requires a truck to transport it. And so it's not a straightforward and simple process to get your data back if the cloud company fails, and it needs time. There have been examples in the US as well of cloud companies that have failed. So Fusion Connect, Nirvanix, and Mega Upload and Mega Cloud. So examples do occur. There are lots of reasons why a service provider can get into difficulties. Ones we'll be familiar with from any company, such as mismanagement, reputational damage, terrorism, natural disasters, COVID-19, and one of the difficulties in this area is that businesses are interconnected. If you use one digital service, that may involve lots of different companies that you have no idea about. So if one of those fails, that can bring down your whole transaction. So it's not even the main company that you're dealing with. It could be one of the ones in the background that makes life difficult. And that's one of the reasons why Lloyd's of London thought that the risks in this area were difficult to anticipate. So coming to insolvency now, what happens in the event of insolvency? So typically, a filing of a petition will bring about an automatic stay. And what impact does that have on your ability to recover your data? There may be difficulties there for customers and questions to be answered by the legal system. Also, if you've got an external manager coming in, they've got a steep learning curve because they're going into a technical business where there might not be many staff around to ask, and they might not realize that the company is holding highly valuable customer data, and that can lead to difficulties. Also, insolvency procedures aren't really geared up for managing digital service insolvencies. The particular problem that's presented is if you've got a digital service provider that is failing and is not viable. If it is viable, then there tend to be procedures that can be used to rescue it, or rehabilitate it somehow, and ensure continuity of service to customers. But outside that, if the business is failing, there's no procedure that really is designed to provide a parachute so that is a soft landing and the company is wound down gradually while the interests of customers are protected. Liquidation's not really about ongoing trading unless it's in the interests of creditors, and it's not really geared up towards protecting the interests of customers. So we have a tension at the heart of digital economy insolvencies that customers will want the business to continue temporarily while their data is retrieved, but that is against the interests of creditors because obviously it generates further costs, and therefore there's potential public interest element that might require a sector-specific approach. Now, of course, you might be thinking, well, isn't it for the consumer to anticipate risks and structure their dealings with digital service providers in a way that limits the risks? And there are things that can be done, such as due diligence, cybersecurity, also various contractual approaches which cover specific aspects. But there's a limit to how effective they are. Insolvencies in this sector haven't really been thought about by many jurisdictions. The only example that I could find is in Luxembourg, where there is a law that clarifies the property issue, that it gives rights to customers to recover intangible property from a debtor. So you've got clarity around what would be a potential legal question mark in some countries, but note that this doesn't provide a supporting framework to keep the business going while that asset is protected. So Luxembourg introduced that as a way to be a first mover in terms of providing an infrastructure for cloud computing. Arguably, it didn't go far enough, and other countries can do more. So to conclude, what we've got here is an area which combines two technical areas, insolvency and computer science, and it needs expertise from both to really work out where the risks are and how they can be handled. And arguably, thought needs to be given to whether a sector-specific approach to insolvencies in this area needs to be developed as part of a digital economy strategy so that the potential of these economies can be maximized and customers can have confidence in the companies that they are using. Okay, so I will not keep you from your dinner any longer, and I think there's time for questions as well. I think it was a mistake to mention dinner, so and you've all had a very long day, so I don't blame you if you don't have any questions. And
Professor Perry,
yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So this is a very interesting viewpoint. What you're saying is that, suppose there's a company which manages gargantuan customer data, and it goes bust. Then what you're arguing is that the data itself is such a big asset that we need to safeguard it. So have you seen such incidences, such litigations, for example, in the UK, where something like this has happened? Because in today's world, Facebook and Twitter and Uber, they're all about data. So it's a very interesting viewpoint.
Yeah, the examples were on the slide. So there have been examples of failed data service centers and cloud service providers. And there have also been outages that give us a hint that if those companies that suffer outages were to fail, then the economic consequences can be disastrous. So there is already evidence that this would be tricky if one of the larger companies failed. But it's not happened yet, and it may be that we need to be proactive so that we can anticipate the risk and it can be mitigated.
for example, I mean, just a counterfactual. Suppose Facebook fails
Yeah.
for whatever reason. People could kill to get their data, right? So, how do you see the role of computer science in, or IT for that matter, to play a role in this?
Yeah, I mean, there have actually been papers written on how devastating it will be for people if Facebook fails because of the personal connection it has. That wasn't really the angle that I was thinking of. Of course, it is relevant to consumers as well, and it may be that there's a too big to fail angle there. But I think these issues need to be worked out.
I think the difference between the cases was like these were only data centers. They were
Yes.
not having access to that particular data. While a Facebook does have a meaningful access to that data, though limited by the user's choice, but then it has a meaningful access to that data. Probably data centers were not having. So
Yeah, and obviously they can't get into the data, but they do have it, and if it's not stored anywhere else, then it's gone. So there are two different risks there, and the Facebook one it wasn't really the focus of this paper, but you are right. It does interact with personal data in ways that need to be thought about.
if we generalize this concept to one of shared risks, do we look at insurance and reinsurance to sort of think about this framework? A data center might go bust, but
Yeah, shared risk is a very good point, because that's the way that the computer industry looks at it, that they can only go so far, and it's really for the customer to identify risk and take steps to mitigate it. I forgot what the rest of your question
no,
was.
my point is, I mean, should we think about data centers and, if there is a risk of the data center not being operational, leading to, customer data loss?
Yeah, the better approach is that customers do anticipate it and don't have what's called a single point of failure, so that if that company falls by the wayside, then that is some important bit of
No,
business
that's from the
gone.
customer side. What about from
Yeah.
the data center side? Is there insurance? Is there a concept of shared risks from the data center's perspective? Do they store their data, for instance, at some other point?
Yeah, I don't know if there's specific insurance of what's safeguarded by the data center. They tend to have standard terms that are quite limiting about their risk of liability, so there may well not be.
And a clarificatory question here
Yeah.
to the group. Suppose you do take insurance from a data center perspective, how do you value the particular asset? I mean, is it just the plant and machinery, or does it have a sense of the data
Yeah,
also?
intangible assets can have quite high values, so it really depends what it is, but there'll be people who would be able to value it and give you an opinion on what it's worth. But insurance could cover you for the loss, but it wouldn't necessarily get you your data back.
Thank you.
I have a possible solution.
Yep.
Example, what you said has some personal implications. For example, banks have stored data in data centers, which are operated by private entities. But there is also a disaster recovery arrangement. So one possible solution is for all users who are using data centers to have a disaster recovery center which is operated by a different entity. Now, I do know of banks and many other IT sector entities who have data centers, they have disaster recovery centers, but for convenience of operation, it's often that both these entities, the data center as well as the disaster recovery center, are operated by the same entities. So maybe it could be a good measure to have these two entities, the data center as well as the disaster recovery center, operate by separate entities. So in case the disaster, the data center entity goes into bankruptcy, so we have the fallback of the disaster recovery center.
Yeah, that's a model that could work if it enabled continuity of service to protect the data. I did, in a previous paper, look at another possibility, which is a levy for the cloud service providers, depending on the volume of user data that they handle. Perhaps they could contribute to a levy which would cover the costs of an insolvency. But that goes back to these issues of what's called regulatory arbitrage. So any one country being able to impose a levy can be difficult, and it might be something that needs international attention. Okay.
Yeah, I have one question.
So we need to close the Q&A session now, because it gives you a break before you have your dinner, I think, and I will be able
ladies
to
and gentlemen, actually we are running behind the schedule, so we can take the questions during the dinner session. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for your elaborate presentation on one of the most topical areas and its relevance for insolvency landscape. Ladies and gentlemen, we now proceed to the workshop on data-driven insolvency research by IBBI, which is being led by Mr. Mahesh Vyas, MD and CEO, Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, and Ms. Kokila Jairam, Deputy General Manager, IBBI. We look forward to hear from you, ma'am. Sir. Thank you, Archana. Very good evening. We are running behind schedule, so we'll try and keep it as short as possible. But I think Professor Das has already put a very difficult question to me. Good news. So I'm not sure if people here are fans of Kung Fu Panda, but I am. So there's Master Oogway, you know, the wise old tortoise master. He says, there's no good or bad, there's only news. So I have only news. You can decide as to the good and bad of it. And Mr. Vyas, I would request your interventions as in when you think necessary. And I would also like to defer a couple of points to you through the presentation. What happened, I mean, all management students here and people dealing with businesses would understand that a typical business cycle before 2016 we would have thought of would include only 4 steps: creation, growth, maturity, and decline. A very typical one. Of course, you have 5 stages, 7-stage business cycles, etc. and all that. But so once when IBC came into play, we saw the introduction of an insolvency process that could kind of enable the recreation of failing businesses. So to make that possible, you know, it could happen even in the decline phase of a business, where the business could take the bank's restructuring route, or if they have a feeling that that business is not viable anymore, they could take exit through the voluntary liquidation option. And if at all they defaulted and were insolvent, then the code provided for, of course, pre-packs if you were a corporate MSME, and for resolution through the corporate insolvency process, or if there was no scope for any resolution, then the business got liquidated. Sorry. So once this expansion of the business cycle was in place, we also found that we expanded the information cycle also around our enterprises and businesses. There was an earlier system of information available, which I think Mr. Vyas here would be able to address more comprehensively than I could. So if you...
Okay, so I will intervene whenever I can regarding this subject. So the first slide that Ms. Jayaraman showed us was about the business cycle and how that is changing because of the existence of IBC, IBBI, etc. So when it comes to creation, when it comes to formation of companies, I think the best thing to look at is the MCA database. Because that's now more or less comprehensive, at least insofar as companies are concerned. When it comes to partnerships, proprietorship, we still have a challenge. But at least one thing is clear, that if you want to know how companies are being formed, how many companies are being formed, MCA website gives you fairly good information regularly, how many companies are getting formed regularly. So creation of companies is possible to see over there. The challenge is after that. So the first thing she has here is business reporting. MCA is good. Listing disclosure, SEBI is fine. That's good. But SEBI is or listed companies is an extremely small set of companies compared to all companies we have. We have lakhs of companies, more than 1 million companies, and we only have about 5,000 listed companies. Of course, those are the more important and active companies, nevertheless. So I think what is important is for there to be a database on the performance of companies, not merely the existence of a company. So the MCA database will tell us that there are these million companies in India, and so many are, deregistered sometimes. A very small sliver is, but all you get is a stock of companies over there. But to know what has been the performance of companies, I think you require a database which has got a database format of the profit and loss statement, of the balance sheet, of the cash flow, wherever possible. Now for that, you require to build that database, and the MCA database is still not able to provide those performance indicators in as much of detail as we would like to. So you rely upon companies like CMI. Sorry, I'm doing a little marketing pitch here, but I'm helpless on that front. Is that you need to use the prowess database to actually understand how have companies progressed, how have they matured, as the slide showed over here, and how they progress into distress. So I think before you come to IBBI, before you come to NCLT, etc., you see distress in financial companies. So I think any scope of building a database to study, to do research on the subject of insolvency, we first need to start from the beginning, which is stress forming in companies, which is best seen in the financial statements of companies. So I think we require to look at the larger set over there and then progress from there into something more difficult. I'll take a minute more. Is that we can see distress in financial statements, but that's last year's information. That's still dated. So you still, are really behind the curve. So the better information is actually available with places where default happen. So default happens primarily with banks. Only banks know that. And then you have information flowing from there. You become an NPA afterwards before you go on to coming into the insolvency business. So I think it'll be good, and this is a suggestion to IBBI, that if it becomes the nodal point for it to actually be the place where all the data is collected. The challenge over here will be that banks will not be willing to give and will not give details of the companies that are defaulting. They'll not give the names of the companies, for example. So if IBBI can play the role of anonymizing this information and bringing together the rest of the information, then motivating the researchers to come in, that could be a good thing. IUs can play a good role as well in that, to become the central point or participate in the central point to ensure that all the information comes together so that research can happen.
That's a law. So that's IBBI regulations provide that the default has to be reported by a financial creditor within 7 days.
Report to who?
Report to the IU.
To the IU.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
and does the IU make it public?
No.
So that's the challenge for researchers.
Yeah. IU does not make it public except at the macroeconomic level. We present only macro data. See, IU is not a public credit repository. Access to IU is restricted to persons as provided in the IU regulations. But there are some interesting aspects. In fact, I'll take another minute just to draw the attention of this august audience. The regulations provide that the auditor of the corporate data, any company, has access to the IU. That is a very little known provision, but it can be used to great effect. And it does not require the consent of the borrower also. The access provisions in the regulations provide that submitter can of course access, all parties to the debt can access, the debtor, the co-applicant, the guarantor, IBBI and AA can access, and besides that, the auditor of the corporate person. This is a very, very important provision. So he can independently verify all the data in respect of submissions by financial creditors.
Yeah, I'll just respond to that. The challenge over here, the objective, I think, from IBBI's perspective here, is to make data available to researchers. Okay, so if the data is available to an auditor, it's still too bilateral. It is still too transactional. What is required over here is for us to be able to pool all the data in, to anonymize it appropriately, so that researchers can then take off from there and help us understand what's happening to companies' performance and how is insolvency working out. That's the objective. So I hope we can work towards that.
Sure, and just one last point, but we do make available data at a macro level. So that's there on our website. So for example, we will tell you how many defaults have been reported, what is the default percentage across various categories of borrowers, individuals, companies, corporates, what is the trend of default? So all that is there. But other than that, it is, because as I said, it's not a public credit repository.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the interjection. IBBI, in all its functions, creates a lot of information by itself, and it also collects and collates information from other institutions and other agencies in the insolvency ecosystem. So we act both as a data creator, provider, and an aggregator at various levels. And the kind of information that we create or aggregate at the IBBI is kind of put to use or used by different categories of users. They vary across, their demands vary, and the kind of rigor that they use, apply on the information that we provide also varies. So broadly from the media doing reporting on the insolvency incidents, to the parliament and the regulator and the ministry making policy interventions. All of this, a lot of this is today being done on whatever evidence that we've been generating from the data that we put together. So apart from IBBI, we also have the information utility as part of our ecosystem. The other service provider agencies are also available. And with the NCLT going into an E mode, we have more of information flowing from the NCLTs also, which right now is not readily available, but should be there anytime sooner once the NCLT is more digital friendly. So moving ahead, I'll just quickly run through all the information that the IBBI currently offers. A lot of you have already used a lot of this data to prepare your papers, and so I will just only quickly list out or give you a glance of what information is available. So on top of our list is the corporate insolvency resolution process. That is the largest chunk of information that IBBI currently gives out. If we look at the newsletter or any publication, the core of it or the heart of it is our CIRP and the reporting that goes around it. I'll just take a minute here to delve on the IBBI's database uses SIN, the company identity number, as its unique identifier. So almost all the data is identified with the SIN. So this SIN offers a lot of scope for researchers who can use it. So today through the presentations, we saw a lot of papers being presented for listed companies, unlisted companies, certain sectoral representations. But there is still a lot of scope that remains if we are to use the SIN and draw down the various options that can be available. For instance, ownership. A company's ownership can be known from its SIN number itself. But so far we've not seen any studies or research as to did ownership make a difference to those companies being in insolvency, being liquidated later on, or things like this. So just the fact that we are using SIN as our unique identifier opens up a lot of scope, and we would request researchers using our data to actually think of exploiting it more constructively. Other than that, we could disaggregate data based on the type of creditor that the IBC gives, maybe the age-wise, the age of the process, the age of the companies, and depending on the kind of outcome that the process has given, or in a way to also do it depending on the professional's performance in that process. So these are quick snapshots of the information that we currently house on our website. These are all available in PDF and Excel downloads. So, and we also see that regular downloads happen, and we also have special requests from researchers for additional information, which this is aggregated at one level. We do have disaggregations of these parameters. So those also generally are provided when researchers have reached out to us. So that's resolutions. You can see we have the trigger, the applicant, the concerning NCLT bench, or the geographical distribution that we can draw down from there, the status when it came into IBC, and then when resolution happened, what actually was the value that we realized. And similarly, we do have a lot of aggregated data that we give out for the outcomes of our liquidation process. Here again, alongside the basic data, we also provide what happened at the end of the liquidation process. So how much was realized, what worth did the assets have, and how much did actually get redeployed. And there is this unique category throughout the day. We've been listening to people talk what happens outside of the code, how withdrawals kind of help, further the objective of IBC, even without going through the CIRP process. Yes, we have a limited set of data available on process withdrawals. So this has also been made available to researchers on request. And going ahead, similar to our corporate insolvency process database, we do also have an extensive disaggregated database on liquidation and voluntary liquidation processes. So this is our outcome in terms of what happened when a company was finally dissolved. And the process of voluntary liquidation is slightly different, but despite that, you can see how the exit option that the IBC brought out has actually helped companies exit. And another important set of data that we have, or information that IBBI currently hosts, is that on insolvency professionals. These professionals are regulated by IBBI, and we do offer a lot of information on almost all the details of these professionals. Coming to think of what data or information can help us do,
IBBI has recently launched a service to applicants and creditors to make a more informed choice when they are trying to choose their professionals. Suppose we have a couple of bankers here. And other operational creditors could also, key in some of the parameters they would want their insolvency professional to have, because before they can make a choice and name him as the professional that they would want to conduct the process for their borrower. So it offers a wide range of information, all objective, that has been put together based on the professional's performance, the number of assignments and all that. So this kind of service, though a small element, gives out a lot of value for the market. Coming back, probably Mr. Vyas would be able to add a little more value as to what other services, or if we could expand to other areas where the information that we currently have or could generate and use further.
No, I think this one was a very useful piece of service where I can go and look for insolvency professionals and their details, their information. So I think this is clearly very valuable. But this is a service, and there can be similar services more in the direction of helping the ecosystem in their transactions. So it's a little different from the research agenda. But when all this comes in pipe delimited format for researchers, then it starts becoming very exciting. So we'd like to see how all this information can also be packaged and made available to researchers. So I think this is just a very good service for the ecosystem. It works fantastically. I think this is something one should applaud.
Thank you, sir. And I wouldn't want to add more to it because Mr. Chowdhury from NES has already briefed us on what the IU has to offer. So in terms of research questions that we see happening in this arena, in the insolvency domain, we are still limited to certain focused areas, and a lot of the other questions remain almost untouched. There are a lot of areas where we've not even bothered to look at. So we would encourage researchers to take a look at all the areas which are yet to see any research or any attention. Especially, we've been tracking the performance of the code and the outcomes, but after resolution, what happened to the sustainability question of these resolved companies, or what happened to those resources that were redeployed through the liquidation process and addressed. Similarly, if there were companies like startups or MSMEs which go through an insolvency process, so their predictions for insolvency would be very different because the risk and resilience in that segment of businesses would be very different from the larger corporates or the medium-sized corporates and their insolvency issues. And similarly, even when we are talking about operational enterprises, businesses running fine today have to be prepared for the eventuality of maybe an insolvency situation. So if that's the case, we do talk about a resolvability index, how an enterprise should prepare itself and keep itself resolvable at all points in time, and how should businesses strategize growth and productivity measures to make resolvability an aspect of it. And similarly, a large amount of focus over the decades, both in the West and currently in the last decade in India, and particularly after IBC, a lot of work has gone into predicting insolvencies. Of course, that's one area that requires a lot of answers. Again, when companies in the twilight zone, there's a lot of questions of companies do take a lot of preventive measures, and we don't know what those preventive measures are, how they affect their insolvency or default expectations, and did IBC make a difference to the kind of preventive measures that companies were earlier taking and the measures that they are currently taking, or maybe in the long term, given that behavioral change in debtors is also to be expected, and changes to financial contracts are expected in the long run, how will these be internalized? All of these research areas are largely unaddressed, so researchers here should take your focuses to these areas of questions also. Would you like?
I'll add one more thing to that. I think researchers can do a huge service to society if we can find the relationship between business cycles and corporate distress, so that we, at least to some extent, ensure that corporate distress is not equated with stigmatized capital. So every failed entrepreneur is stigmatized oftentimes. But failure could also be a function of business cycles. It could be a function of many other externalities. So finding the macro conditions under which distress happens is a matter of research. I think that's what I think you were trying to get at. But delinking business cycles or externalities compared to specific cases of business failure. And there could be cases of fraud as well, but basically it is business cycles, there could be company-specific things, and there could be other things. So research in that area would be immensely helpful to ensure that capitalists don't get stigmatized.
So we've opened up a lot of questions for you. I hope, Professor Das, it's good news. So, of course, a lot has been said, and has always been, we continue to say that evidence-based policy making is important, and all of us should be doing it. So, IBBI is slowly taking steps to get the first item of this long list of enablers in place. We're trying to give you high-quality evidence on relevant topics that we think we can do. So, in terms of the evidence or the information that we are hoping to generate would be both objective quantitative data, and because it's an economic legislation, we cannot separate the law and the jurisprudence from the economic outcomes. So both of them go hand in hand. And there are a lot of questions of quality in terms of reliability. And in this ecosystem, given that we have the court in place and it's a legal process, of course, there are a lot of challenges inherent to standardizing information generation, or its collations not as simplistic as one would think it to be. Despite that, we do take measures to ensure that whatever we are making available is accurate, and keep it as objective as possible, and wherever we are picking samples, that they are as representative as possible. And given that issues or limitations of data, there's always this question of credibility. So at least IBBI has always ensured that data that IBBI gives out is something that you can trust on. And in terms of technical rigor, like I said, because this is a legal process in operation, so it needs to be, every piece of information needs to be understood in terms of its position in the law. So that technical rigor is also what we've tried to incorporate in generating and providing the information. And of course, in terms of practical considerations of handling data, I think Mr. Vyas would be better placed to give us a few more thoughts.
So, to react over here, there is this worry about reliability, credibility, and so on and so forth. We need to figure out how much responsibility can we take as providers of data. So, for example, when CMI provides data about a company, about balance sheets and so on and so forth, we cannot be held responsible for the financial statements of companies. We take it as a given. So what is more important, at least from a researcher's point of view, will be, from a database building point of view, will be to ensure some degree of standardization of the data. If you change the definitions too often, then that makes it very difficult for researchers to use the data. So what is important, like CIN is very important in ensuring that I can walk across from one source to another to see the same company information being put together. Similarly, I think what's more important for the building of databases and the providing of databases is to ensure that we maintain a certain degree of standardization and stability in the way the data is put forth. Now, if you worry too much about whether this is credible or not, who is holding responsibility for what is the question you need to ask. Are you certifying this data to be right, or are you merely putting together the data and making it available? Saying, I have high fidelity with respect to the source from where I've got the data, and no more than that. If the source itself is fraudulent, you can't be responsible for it. You can, at the most, if you know it, highlight. But for the rest, credibility, reliability are slightly over-hyped things in building of databases. What is important is lots of data and standardized data. I mean, don't give unreliable data or not credible data, but don't fuss too much over it. What's more important is standardized and lots of data and very fast.
So I think that was not so much good news. So yes, all data sets that we have and all information we have comes with a lot of caveats and limitations. Like we said, we don't intend to change definitions, but when courts change their rulings and end up changing definitions, we can't help it. We'll have to include it in our data collection efforts. And similarly, delays and incomplete reporting is also a possibility. So researchers, when you are accessing information from the IBBI database, please feel free to contact us so that we would be able to brief you on the lags or the missing portions or gaps. And right now we do not have a robust system to put out all information in the public domain, but of course we are working towards it. In the meanwhile, we've been addressing all research requests that have been coming to us. So we would encourage all of you to ask, demand, when there's a demand, then we would be forced to provide that information. So put out this request to all of you to raise questions, to ask for information, which then we would also be forced to dig out and give it to you. So that's the future. We hope eventually we reach some place where, somebody can say that, okay, if we go to IBBI, then IBBI's database will give me information on the history of the company and probably a good look at its prospects into the future, something like that. So with that, I think I should say thank you. We did target to complete in half hour, but I think we've exceeded by 5 minutes there. Thank you. So I think it's too late for me to take any questions, but we are here for dinner, so please feel free to raise any points that you would like to discuss.
May I request everyone to please be seated? Thank you, ma'am, for this comprehensive presentation and taking us through the intricacies of the novel research initiative by the IBBI. Ladies and gentlemen, may I now request Mr. Sandeep Garg, Executive Director IBBI, to present a small memento as a token of our gratitude and appreciation for the contribution to the speakers. May I request Mr. Prashant Das to kindly accept the memento. Can we have a round of applause, please? May I request Ms. Rebecca Perry to kindly accept the memento. May I request Mr. Mahesh Vyas to kindly accept the memento. May I request Ms. Kokila Jairam to kindly accept the memento. Thank you so much, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, we at IBBI and on behalf of IIM Ahmedabad extend our heartfelt gratitude to all the distinguished dignitaries, panelists, presenters, and other invitees for sparing their valuable time and gracing us with their presence and contributing to the research initiatives. We also thank the participants and stakeholders who joined us online, and we look forward to have your participation tomorrow for the second day of the conference, and here we conclude the day one of the conference. So ladies and gentlemen, I request you to kindly join us for dinner at the lawn outside the auditorium. Thank you and good evening to all.